It's kind of crazy to think about, but like a little over 10 years ago,
Yeah.
people going to work at a place that made microwave popcorn
Uh-huh.
ended up getting really sick with a pretty bad lung disease. I mean, we've all heard of popcorn lung,
Right.
but it's like a serious thing.
Right.
And it all came about because people were breathing in all this artificial butter flavoring.
Yeah.
It really makes you think twice about what we're putting into the air and breathing.
Absolutely.
Like, things we eat might be totally safe, but
Yeah.
what happens when they get into our lungs?
Right.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, it really highlights how the way we're exposed to a substance
Yeah,
really changes its potential to cause harm.
totally.
Something you can eat with no problem
Right,
could end up being a major threat to your lungs.
exactly.
So in this deep dive, we're going to trace the story of this
Yeah.
lung disease tied to all these flavorings,
Okay.
starting with how it was first discovered, all the way to some fascinating new research that's coming out.
Cool.
We're going to be taking a close look at the sources you provided,
Yeah.
which cover those original cases in the popcorn factories,
Uh-huh.
the science behind the specific chemicals involved,
Right.
and the growing worries about e-cigarettes.
Yeah, that's a huge topic these days.
Absolutely.
Especially with
But yeah,
so many young people vaping.
right. So
Yeah.
our goal here is to really distill out the key information and understand the risks.
Totally. And helping us navigate all the science and medical details is our expert.
Right.
You might be surprised to learn just how much we've discovered about this problem in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, it's been a rapidly evolving area of research.
Yeah. And it affects way more than just those people working in popcorn plants.
Definitely.
So like we said,
Yeah.
it all started in these microwave popcorn factories. Imagine a bunch of workers all of a sudden start having these terrible coughs, wheezing, and struggling to breathe. At first you might think, oh, it's just like a bad cold going around or something.
Right.
But it turned out to be much worse than that.
It was much more serious.
Yeah.
What they were developing was something called bronchiolitis obliterans.
Yeah.
Now that popcorn lung nickname
Right.
makes it sound kind of harmless,
Yeah.
but
It's a really scary condition.
it really is. This is a serious and irreversible condition
Wow.
involving permanent scarring and narrowing
Oh, wow.
of those tiny airways in your lungs
Okay.
called bronchioles.
Right.
It's a condition that shares a lot more in common with severe respiratory diseases like COPD
Okay.
than with a simple passing illness.
I see.
So it's nothing to take lightly.
And it took a really astute physician in Missouri
Yeah.
to start to put the pieces together back in May of 2000.
Okay.
This doctor noticed this cluster of 8 former employees from the same microwave popcorn plant,
Right.
all showing up with these unusual and really severe breathing problems. That initial observation was like the spark.
Right.
That led to a much bigger investigation
Okay.
by NEO,
Okay.
the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
the agency that investigates workplace safety and health issues.
Right.
And tries to prevent work-related illnesses and injuries.
So it's a big deal when they get involved.
Absolutely.
So NEOS is on the case now,
Yeah.
and they're trying to figure out what's going on. So
Right.
how did they actually do that?
Well, lung function tests played a crucial role,
Okay.
specifically a test called spirometry,
Okay.
which measures how much air someone can exhale
Uh-huh.
and how quickly they can do it.
Okay.
And there's a specific measurement they use called FEV1,
Okay.
which stands for forced expiratory volume in 1 second
Okay.
in these workers.
Yeah.
These tests showed significant and persistent airway obstruction.
Oh, wow.
This really solidified the idea
Yeah.
that this wasn't just a temporary problem.
Right.
And what's even more telling, their breathing didn't improve with the standard medications
Oh, wow.
that are usually effective at opening up the airways.
I see.
So this really pointed towards a fixed scarring problem
Okay.
in those small airways.
So NIOSH starts their investigation at the popcorn plant.
Yeah,
And they start looking at what these workers were exposed to.
right.
And a lot of it was like stuff we eat all the time.
Uh-huh.
Popcorn itself,
Okay.
soybean oil, salt, food coloring, and of
Yeah.
course the butter flavoring.
Yeah.
But when they focused on the area where the butter flavoring was mixed,
Uh-huh.
they found something really interesting.
Okay.
There were over 100 different volatile organic compounds.
Well, that's a lot.
I know.
So many chemicals in the air.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
the one that really stood out
Right.
was diacetyl,
Okay.
or 2,3-butadiene.
That's the chemical name for it.
Right.
Yeah.
And get this,
So,
the average concentration in that mixing room was an insane 57.2 parts per million.
wow.
That's super high.
That's an incredibly high level
Yeah.
to be breathing in.
And it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
Other areas of the plant had much lower levels of diacetyl. Like the packaging area was at 2.8 parts per million.
Okay.
And the quality control lab was only 0.8.
Right.
But even these lower concentrations seem to be affecting some of the workers.
Wow, so even lower levels
Yeah,
could still be harmful.
it seems so.
And the researchers found this really important link.
Yeah.
The more a worker was exposed to diacetyl over time,
Uh-huh.
the more their lung function declined.
Oh, wow.
Specifically that FEV1 measurement we talked about.
So the more exposure, the worse their breathing got.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just what they were measuring at the plant.
Right.
Here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Around the same time, scientists were doing some studies with rats.
Okay.
They were exposing them to the fumes from artificial butter flavoring.
Interesting.
The same stuff that had all that diacetyl in it.
Right?
And guess what they found? The fumes caused significant damage
Oh, wow.
to the lining of the airways in those rats.
So it was actually harming their lungs.
Yeah.
This is a crucial piece of evidence.
Yeah.
It provides biological plausibility
Okay.
to the idea that breathing in diacetyl could damage human lungs.
So they're seeing the same kind of damage in the rats that they were seeing in the workers.
Right.
And here's another really interesting thing.
Okay.
Once they started implementing safety measures at that original popcorn plant, like better ventilation and respirators for the workers,
Right.
the risk of developing lung disease dropped significantly for most of the workforce.
That's really important.
Yeah.
Strengthens the connection between exposure and the illness.
Right, so taking those steps to reduce exposure actually made a difference.
Exactly. It shows that taking action can protect workers.
And it's important to remember that diacetyl isn't some weird, obscure chemical. It's actually found naturally in things like butter and beer. And you know, the FDA, they had actually classified diacetyl as GRAS, which means generally recognized as safe
Right.
for use as a food additive.
So it's considered safe to eat,
Right.
but as we're seeing,
Yeah.
breathing it in is a whole different story.
Exactly. So diacetyl was the main culprit in those popcorn factory cases.
Yeah.
But what is it about this chemical that makes it so dangerous to breathe in?
Right, let's delve into the chemistry a little bit.
Okay.
So diacetyl belongs to a class of chemicals called alpha dicarbonyl compounds.
Okay.
And that basically means it has a very reactive structure with two carbonyl groups.
Okay.
And a carbonyl group is just a carbon atom that's double bonded to an oxygen atom.
Okay.
And it's the fact that there are two of these carbonyl groups
Right
next to each other
Okay.
that makes it so reactive. And there's ongoing research into exactly how these carbonyl groups cause damage in our cells.
Right.
It seems that they can interact with all sorts of cellular components,
Yeah.
including these things called amino acids,
Okay.
which are the building blocks of proteins. And one specific amino acid that's been studied a lot is arginine.
Okay.
There's even research with visuals
Oh.
showing these interactions
Okay.
and how the size of these molecules influences how strongly they bind to arginine.
Wow. So it's like a lock and key kind of thing.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Cool.
The shape and size of the molecule determine how well it fits
Right.
and interacts with other molecules.
And it's not just diacetyl we need to be concerned about.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of these alpha dicarbonyl compounds.
Yeah, like a whole family of them.
Okay.
Like 2,3-pentadione,
Okay.
2,3-hexanedione,
Uh-huh.
and even some that are produced naturally in our own bodies,
Okay.
like glyoxal and methylglyoxal. And the worry is that these other compounds might act in similar ways to diacetyl
Okay.
and also pose a risk to our lungs.
So they could be just as dangerous.
Potentially, yes.
And these chemicals seem to be pretty volatile.
Yes, they are.
I read that diacetyl and 2,3-pentanedone have pretty low boiling points
Right.
and high vapor pressures.
That's right.
What does that mean in terms of the risk of breathing them in?
Well, that volatility basically means
Yeah.
that these compounds can easily evaporate into the air.
Oh, okay.
So they become airborne.
Uh-huh.
And that makes it much more likely that we'll breathe them in.
Right.
And what's even more concerning
Yeah.
is that heat can actually increase the amount of these chemicals that gets into the air.
Oh, wow.
Think about those big vats of hot butter flavoring in the popcorn factories.
Yeah.
Or even the heating coils in e-cigarettes.
Right.
That heat can really drive up the concentration of these chemicals in the vapor.
I see. So that heat makes them even more likely to be inhaled. So it's not just industrial settings where we might encounter these chemicals.
Right.
I was surprised to learn that alpha dicarbonyl compounds can even form in other places, like through reactions between common cleaning products and ozone.
That's right.
So they could be indoor air pollutants too.
Exactly.
Wow.
So while the biggest exposures have been in workplaces,
Right.
it's important to be aware
Yeah.
that these chemicals can pop up in other unexpected places
Right.
and potentially pose a risk to our health.
Okay, so the initial focus was on those popcorn factory workers.
Yeah, it was the first place where the problem was identified.
But it turns out it wasn't just them.
Right.
The lung disease linked to diacetyl started showing up in other places too.
Unfortunately, yes.
Once that connection was made in that first popcorn plant, they started investigating other microwave popcorn factories.
Right.
And sadly, they found similar cases of lung disease.
Yeah, it was a pattern,
Yeah.
especially among workers who mixed the flavoring.
Right. So again, it was that direct exposure
Yeah.
to high concentrations of diacetyl. And they even found a connection between the number of years someone spent mixing the flavorings
Right.
and how much their lung function had decreased.
So the longer they worked,
Yeah.
the worse their lungs got.
And it wasn't just popcorn anymore either.
Right.
They found cases of bronchiolitis obliterans in workers at a plant that actually made diacetyl.
Oh, wow. So even the production of the chemical
Yeah.
was a risk.
And they also found it in workers at flavoring production facilities who were handling pure diacetyl.
Right.
So it wasn't just the flavorings themselves, but the raw ingredient too.
Exactly. Handling the concentrated chemical
Yeah.
was also a hazard.
There was even this big surveillance program in California looking at workers in different industries.
Right.
And they found a higher risk of
Yeah.
severe airway obstruction in workers who were exposed to flavorings.
And it was specifically linked to companies that used more diacetyl.
So again, that connection between exposure and illness.
Yeah. The more diacetyl,
Yeah.
the higher the risk.
And then there were the cases in coffee processing plants,
Right.
which was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, it's not the first thing you think of.
But when you think about it,
Yeah.
it makes sense.
Right.
These workers were exposed to high levels of diacetyl
Mm-hmm.
and another alpha dicarbonyl compound,
Mm-hmm.
2,3-pentanedione,
Yeah.
both in areas where flavorings were used
Right.
and also in areas where they were grinding unflavored roasted coffee beans.
Oh, wow.
So the chemicals were present,
Yeah.
even without added flavorings.
Interesting.
And when they did lung biopsies on some of these workers, they actually found constrictive bronchiolitis.
Oh, wow. So it was definitely the same lung disease.
Exactly.
It's really striking to see how much more common severe airflow limitation is
Yeah,
in these workforces exposed to diacetyl
right.
compared to the general population. It really highlights
Yeah.
how serious this inhalation hazard can be.
And that brings us to e-cigarettes,
Yeah.
which is a big concern these days.
Absolutely.
How does what we've learned about diacetyl in the workplace connect to the use of flavored e-cigarettes?
Well, as we've talked about,
Yeah,
diacetyl is added to a lot of e-cigarette flavorings
Right.
to create those appealing tastes
yeah.
like vanilla, maple, and coconut.
Uh-huh.
So while the popcorn industry has mostly stopped using diacetyl.
Right, because of all the health problems.
Exactly.
E-cigarette users might still be breathing it in.
Yeah, and directly into their lungs.
It's like we learned this lesson in the popcorn factories, but now it's happening all over again with vaping.
Yeah, it's a concerning parallel.
Yeah. And one of the studies you shared was from Harvard,
Right.
and they tested a bunch of different e-cigarette brands,
Huh?
and they found diacetyl in 39 out of 51 of the brands.
Wow, that's a majority of them.
Yeah, that's a really scary finding.
It is quite alarming.
Yeah.
And they also looked for two other alpha dicarbonyl compounds,
Okay.
2,3-pentanedione and acetoin.
Uh-huh.
And they found those in a lot of the e-liquids too.
So it's not just diacetyl.
Right.
It's a whole bunch of these potentially harmful chemicals.
Exactly.
And actually, about 92% of the e-cigarettes they tested had at least one of those three chemicals in them.
Wow. So almost all of them
Yeah.
contained at least one of these potentially dangerous compounds.
The American Lung Association is really worried about this. They say that people are inhaling these things without even knowing it, and that's a big problem.
It highlights the need for more awareness about the potential risks of vaping.
And what's even more concerning is that the FDA initially delayed requiring e-cigarette companies to submit information about their ingredients for review.
Yeah, they pushed the deadline back to 2022.
Which led to a lawsuit.
From the American Lung Association and other groups.
Right, they were concerned about the delay.
Yeah. It's like, we need to know what's in these products.
Exactly. Transparency is crucial.
Yeah.
Especially with something that people are inhaling.
Right.
And especially considering how popular vaping has become.
Especially among young people.
Exactly.
So we know that breathing in diacetyl and these other chemicals can cause this serious lung damage. But let's dig into how exactly they're doing that. Like, what's happening in our bodies?
Okay, so the main target seems to be the respiratory epithelium.
Okay.
Which is the lining of our airways.
Right.
From our nose all the way down to the tiny bronchioles in our lungs.
Okay.
And remember those studies with rats?
Yeah, where they were exposed to the butter flavoring?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those studies showed that both the butter flavoring with diacetyl in it and pure diacetyl by itself caused cell death.
Oh, wow.
In this respiratory epithelium.
And the damage was most noticeable in the rats' noses.
Okay.
But it also affected the bronchi, which are the larger airways in the lungs.
Okay.
And there were even images in the research.
Oh, cool.
Showing this damage.
Okay.
Like the cell death and inflammation in the nasal passages and bronchi of those rats exposed to the fumes.
And it's important to remember
Yeah.
that rats breathe differently than humans.
Absolutely.
They're obligate nasal breathers.
Right.
Which means they breathe mostly through their noses.
Exactly. Their noses are really good at filtering out stuff they inhale.
Okay.
But humans, we often breathe through our mouths.
Especially when we're exercising.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that means that more of the stuff we inhale
Right.
can bypass the nose and go straight into our lungs.
Okay.
Including those small airways.
Right.
The bronchioles.
Which is where the damage from bronchiolitis obliterans happens. So that difference in breathing is really important. The research even gave an example.
Okay.
A worker doing some light exercise and breathing in just 12 parts per million of diacetyl could have the same level of exposure in their bronchioles.
Wow.
As a rat breathing in 200 parts per million.
That's a big difference.
I know.
It really shows how much more vulnerable our lungs might be compared to those rats.
So it's not just about the concentration in the air.
Right.
It's about how much actually reaches our lungs.
Exactly.
And we know that bronchiolitis obliterans involves scarring of those small airways.
Right, that fibrosis that blocks airflow.
And studies have shown that diacetyl and 2,3-pentonegione can actually cause this airway fibrosis in rodents.
Yeah.
They've tested it in different ways, like putting it directly into the trachea and having them breathe it in.
Right, so different ways of exposing them.
Yeah.
And all of them led to fibrosis.
There were also these really important long-term studies done by the National Toxicology Program.
Yeah, the NTP.
Yeah.
They exposed rats and mice to diacetyl for 2 years.
Wow.
And even at a relatively low level of 50 parts per million.
Okay.
They found significant fibrosis in the nose, trachea, and bronchi.
So even that low level was enough to cause damage.
Over that long period of time.
And what's even more concerning is that exposure level is lower than what some workers were exposed to back in those popcorn factories.
So it's a realistic level of exposure that could be happening in workplaces.
And the NTP study also found some evidence that diacetyl might be carcinogenic.
Right.
Meaning it could potentially cause cancer.
Yeah, they saw nasal tumors in rats.
Oh, wow.
And some evidence in female mice.
Okay.
But more research is needed to confirm that link.
And it's not just animal studies either.
Right.
Scientists have also done experiments with human airway epithelial cells growing in a dish.
And they found that diacetyl can kill these cells.
Oh, wow.
And also mess up how they function.
So it's directly harming the cells that line our airways.
Right.
So we're seeing all this damage.
Yeah.
But why is it happening?
Okay, so let's get into the mechanisms of toxicity.
Okay.
One key thing to remember is that when tissues are injured repeatedly, it can trigger fibrosis.
Okay.
And that's what we're seeing with diacetyl.
Right, it's causing that repeated injury.
Exactly.
To the airway lining.
And when the body tries to repair that damage, it can sometimes go overboard and lead to excessive scarring.
And that's the fibrosis.
Exactly.
We see in bronchiolitis obliterans.
Right.
And it's those alpha dicarbonyl compounds that are causing that initial injury.
Right. They're very reactive.
Yeah.
And can interact with all sorts of molecules in our cells.
Okay.
Particularly proteins.
Okay.
Diacetyl can actually modify these proteins.
Oh, wow.
It could bind to them and change their structure.
Okay.
And it can also interact with our DNA.
Oh, wow.
And even contribute to the production of harmful reactive oxygen species.
So it's like causing damage on multiple fronts.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted attack on the cell.
And you mentioned earlier this thing called proteostasis.
Right.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, proteostasis is basically the cell's way of keeping its proteins in check.
Oh, okay.
Making sure they're functioning properly. And getting rid of any damaged or misfolded proteins.
Okay.
It involves a couple of main processes.
Okay.
One is called the ubiquitin proteasome system.
Okay.
Which is like the cell's recycling program.
Okay.
It tags damaged proteins and then breaks them down.
I see.
And the other process is called autophagy.
Okay.
Which is like a more general cleanup crew.
Okay.
That gets rid of cellular debris. Including those damaged proteins.
So these are like the cell's quality control systems,
Yes.
making sure everything is running smoothly. And it sounds like diacetyl can mess with these systems.
Yes, it can.
Okay.
When cells are exposed to diacetyl,
Yeah.
we see a buildup of those ubiquitinated proteins,
Okay.
which means the recycling program is getting overwhelmed.
Oh, wow.
And there's even a decrease in the amount of free ubiquitin,
Okay.
which is like running out of tags to label the stuff that needs to be recycled.
So it's like the system's getting overloaded.
Exactly.
And it can't keep up.
Right.
And that can lead to cell damage.
Yes, it can.
Wow.
And potentially to disease.
And it's interesting that the research also mentions potential effects of these chemicals beyond just the lungs.
Right.
Like they've seen changes in the olfactory bulb, which is involved in our sense of smell, and changes in gene activity in the brain.
Wow.
And also changes in sensory nerve endings.
So it's suggesting that these chemicals might have wider reaching effects.
than we initially thought.
Exactly.
Now, you also shared some new research looking at chemicals that are often found alongside diacetyl and also at this compound called methyl glycol.
Right.
What were they trying to figure out with these new experiments?
So they had a couple of main questions.
Okay.
First, they wanted to know if being exposed to other chemicals at the same time as diacetyl, like acetylcholine and acetic acid, would make the lung damage from diacetyl worse.
Okay.
Because in real-world workplaces,
Yeah.
people aren't just exposed to one chemical at a time.
Right. It's usually a mixture of things.
Exactly.
So they wanted to see how those mixtures would behave.
Right.
Okay. And what about methyl glyoxal?
Well, methyl glyoxal is another alpha dicarbonyl compound.
Okay.
And based on its structure, they thought it might actually be more toxic
Oh, wow.
than diacetyl when inhaled,
Okay.
because it has a shorter carbon chain and an aldehyde group,
Okay.
which tends to be more reactive.
Then the ketone group in diacetyl. So they thought the methyl glyoxal might be even worse. Okay, so what did they find out?